In chapter 2, the feet and the toes are one unit. It's a fact easily demonstrated not just by the description of them being one unit in the text, but also by the rock striking the feet, not the toes, in order to destroy it. If the Bible wanted to make a big deal about the 10 toes, it would have said, by the way, there are 10 toes. But it doesn't. There is no mention of the number of toes on the statue in the text. For example, I believe that we're supposed to pay attention to the 3 ribs in the bear's mouth, and in the next chapter, the 2 horns on the ram's head. Or even in this chapter, the 10 horns on this beast's head are very significant. But when a number is not mentioned, we should not read them into the text. For example, no one tries to draw attention to the 10 fingers on the hands of the statue, which represent Medo-Persia, because there's no correlation there. It's taking the analogy too far. We wouldn't note that there are 2 eyes and ears on the statue's head either. When the Bible is silent, we should be too. That being said, I do have some agreement with the traditional view at this point, in that I think that the kingdom that the Antichrist comes from will have 10 kings, because of this passage in Daniel 7, and because of its interpretation by the angel, which we will get to later. Perhaps it might even be like representatives of the European Union or a similar organization, and the Antichrist will subdue 3 of those kings before ultimately taking over the whole organization. I think that this organization will be associated with the West in some way, as does Charles Cooper, but it is not required to be the revived Roman Empire. And I hope that if someone has the time, they will see my study on Daniel 2 to find out why I say that. There are 2 grammatical clues in this verse that support the overall premise that the 4 beasts are contemporaneous and not successive. The first is the use of the word before in verse 7, as in, it was different from all the beasts that were before it. The word before here is the Aramaic word godam, which is only used in the spatial sense and never in the temporal sense. In other words, it is never used in the time sense, like he tied his shoes before he ran. It is only used in the sense of being in front of something, like I put some food before the king. One example of how this word is used is in Daniel 2, verse 25. Then Arioch quickly brought Daniel before the king and said thus to him, I have found a man of the captives of Judah who will make known to the king the interpretation. There is a totally different word if you wanted to speak of something happening before something else, as in time. So when it says it was different from all the beasts that were before it, it's saying it was different than all the beasts that were in front of it. It must mean grammatically that the other beasts are spatially in front of it, which means that these beasts must be on earth at the same time. This brings me to my second grammatical clue in this verse. This phrase, trampling the residue with its feet. We will see that this also supports the idea that these beasts are contemporaneous. Charles Cooper says the following on this point. The importance of the translations of this verse is evident by examining several Bible translations. The NASB says, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrifying and extremely strong, and it had large iron teeth. It devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet. The ESV says, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. The King James Version says, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped the residue with its feet. And finally, the NIV says, a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. Cooper continues, the reader should discern that the translations, with the exception of the NIV, place the final clause as the object of all 3 verbs. Does, quote, what was left go with the final verb to stamp, or with all 3 verbs to devour, to break in pieces, and to stamp? The answer to this question, along with the question regarding the meaning of the clause, what was left, support our contention that the 4 kings' kingdoms of Daniel 7 reign upon the earth at the same time. If the clause what was left applies only to the verb to stamp, we would have to conclude that the clause refers to the things the beast did not devour or break in pieces. In other words, what was left is everything else the beast is not able to devour or break in pieces. If the beast could not eat it or break it, he stamped on it. The other option is to take what was left as the object of all three verbs: to devour, to break in pieces, and to stamp, which is reflected in most translations. Taken in this sense, what was left represents everything the first three beasts do not control. In other words, the four kings' kingdoms divided the world up between them. The lion king, the bear king, and the leopard king, and the diverse king each get a fourth. In context, what was left is best taken to refer to the part of the earth that did not fall under the control of the first three kings or kingdoms. The next verse, verse 8, says, "I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom three of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words." On this verse, I would have no disagreements with anybody on the traditional view. We would both agree that this is speaking of the Antichrist. There are many ways to determine that all throughout Scripture. The Antichrist here appears to start his ascent to power by doing something to three of the 10 kings that are part of this quarter of the world. So there are 10 rulers over this quarter of the world, which he does something to 3 of them. And this is something that should be quite evident to somebody that was looking for this. I think it shouldn't be an ambiguous thing. This is something that will be quite obvious. The next 3 verses say, "I watched till thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. His garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. I watched then because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking. I watched till the beast was slain, and its body destroyed, and given to the burning flame." So Daniel now sort of shifts his attention to a new character in the vision, the Ancient of Days. This is a reference, I believe, to Yahweh, though some might say it's to Jesus Christ, though the same description is applied to Jesus in Revelation. But later we'll see the Son of Man, whom Jesus identified with, interacting with the Ancient of Days. This is one of those go-to passages for the 2 powers in heaven idea, that is, 2 beings that were identified as Yahweh at the same time in the same place. The idea is well described by Dr. Michael Heiser, and there's a whole lot to discuss about it, but it's out of the scope of our study, which is focused on the prophetic implications of this passage, so I will leave that study to you, which I highly recommend. Daniel is now going to watch the Ancient of Days destroy the beast with the little horn by giving it to the burning flame. These verses are very important for our discussion because they correspond directly to events in the book of Revelation. If we compare the 2 books, we'll see that Daniel is giving us very specific information about the timing of the events being described in this chapter. Let's start with the first phrase, "I watched till thrones were put in place." I will read from the last part of Revelation 19 to the first part of Revelation 20. Remember, there are no chapter breaks in the original languages. And I want you to notice a few different things that correspond directly to our verse. First, you will see that the Antichrist is cast into the lake of fire, just as it happens in our passage in Daniel 7. It says, "Then the beast was captured, and with him the false prophet, who worked signs in his presence, by which he deceived those who received the mark of the beast, and those who worshipped his image. These 2 were cast alive into the lake of fire, burning with brimstone." Then we read that thrones are set up after that, which corresponds with Daniel 7 as well. It says in Revelation 20, verse 4a, "And I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was committed to them." These thrones are for some or all believers in Christ who will judge angels and men at this time. Paul says the following in 1 Corinthians, "Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world will be judged by you, are you unworthy to judge the smallest matters? Do you not know that we will judge angels? How much more things that pertain to this life?" The comparisons to the time just before the millennial reign of Christ are very important, and Daniel will continue to make unambiguous references to that time, as we will see. One reason I want to show you this is because I think it helps to explain the next verse. Daniel 7:12 says, "As for the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time." There is no doubt that the other beasts of Daniel 7 are in view here. That is, the lion, the bear, and the leopard. It says that their dominion is taken away, but their lives are prolonged for a time. Contextually, their lives are prolonged after the Antichrist is destroyed. This verse is very difficult to get around if you still hold the traditional view, because the other beasts are long gone by this point. Stephen Miller of the New American Commentary, who holds to the traditional view, offers the following to try to explain this most serious problem. He says, how could these beasts lose their authority and still exist? The explanation is that their dominance ceased, but they continued to live because they were absorbed into the next empire. For example, Greece was conquered by Rome, and although Greek dominance came to an end, the nation continued to live by being absorbed into another one of the earthly kingdoms, the Roman Empire. So according to Miller, when Daniel says, as for the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time, he means that there would still be Neo-Babylonian or Medo-Persian blood on the earth at that time, which is almost impossible to believe for purely genetic reasons. This also presumes that the Bible sees kingdoms in a purely ethnic sense, which is very difficult when dealing with kingdoms like the Romans, who are very ethnically diverse. I would suggest that the answer to this is just what this particular verse says. After the Antichrist is destroyed at Armageddon, there will still be people and indeed nations on the earth who will populate the 1,000-year period after the sheep and goat judgment. This has explicit biblical support. We know that there will be specifically identifiable nations in the millennium. For example, Zechariah 14:16-19, Egypt is mentioned. In fact, in that same passage, it specifically says that some of the same nations that were part of the final battles would be serving the Lord during this time. It says, and it shall come to pass that every one that is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall even go up from year to year to worship the King. So it actually makes good chronological sense if these other three nations were allowed to live on for a time, and the only time that it could be referring to after the Antichrist is destroyed is the 1,000-year period, and we have explicit biblical reference to the nations that warred against God at that time would be allowed to continue in their existence after the millennium, except they would be worshiping God at that time, then there is no more problems with this. Another interesting fact that I think is important here is the mentioning of these same animals, which represent the nations in Daniel 7, mentioned in these verses about the millennium. For example, Isaiah 11, although symbolically. It says, for example, starting in verse 6, the wolf also shall dwell with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, the calf and the young lion, and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young ones shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like an ox. Now, we shouldn't build doctrine on things like that, but given the other scriptures, I think that is very interesting. The next two verses say, I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed. I'm going to focus on this phrase, one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. This again is pointing to the specific period of time in which these events happen. This vision of the Son of Man is not out of chronological context with the destruction of the final beast. This phrase, one like the Son of Man coming on the clouds, is a technical term used very often by the Lord, and it is referring not to the rapture, but rather to Revelation 14:14-20, in which the cloud rider and the angels destroy the wicked earth dwellers. It says, Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and on the cloud sat one like the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, Thrust in your sickle and reap, for the time is come for you to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. So he who sat on the cloud thrust in his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped. Then another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, he also having a sharp sickle. And another angel came out of the altar, who had power over fire, and he cried with a loud cry to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, Thrust in your sharp sickle, and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe. So the angel thrust in his sickle into the earth and gathered the vines of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trampled outside the city, and blood came out of the winepress up to the horses'